So another point that anthropologists would make is that economies are institutions, and what we mean by that is that we've set them up a certain way. They're not just naturally that way. I have here, I think this is from Florida, a high-rise apartment complex, or maybe it's a hotel. I spent a couple of years living in South Florida, and there I was rather shocked to see the very glaring wealth disparities. So, for example, you'd have these really, really expensive high-rise apartments that would be right on the beach, and then really like a mile away, you would have government housing where clearly people were experiencing food insecurity, and that was within, a mile or two of each other. And of course, sometimes we just say, well, that's kind of the way it is, and that is kind of the way it is in our current economy, but that's not kind of the way it is in all societies, right? There are societies where wealth inequality is smaller. There's societies where, at least until pretty recently, wealth inequality in the way that we think of it doesn't really exist. That doesn't mean it's a perfect equality, but that any sort of inequality is much smaller and typically more about status than wealth. And so that's what we mean when we say economies are institutions, that they're sort of something that's culturally set up, and that's one of the reasons why societies are so different in terms of an issue like wealth inequality, because it's something where culture has chosen to go down one path and not another. Which brings up the point that economies can be changed over time, and that's part of what politicians argue about, is which way we should change the economy, of course. Now, as I talk about economy, by the way, you're probably picturing things like the stock market or things like a supply and demand curve. And that's embedded sort of linguistically in the way that we speak in the United States. We have, linguistic anthropologists sometimes talk about linguistic emphasis, the idea of cultures have a lot of words for the things that really matter to them. And we have lots and lots and lots of words to refer to markets and finances and budgets and economics and monies and debit and credit. We have a very advanced vocabulary to talk about the economy, but typically when we say the economy, what we mean is this kind of stuff. We mean stock market, we mean supply demand, we mean the price that oil's going at. We don't usually think of this, an Inupiat man doing some ice fishing, right? And yet from an anthropological perspective, although yes, the stock market is a type of economy, so is an Inupiat man getting a couple of fish out of the ice and then going and divvying it up among his friends and family. And so for that matter is a Wakwa potlatch in British Columbia, where folks are sort of accumulating vast amount of gifts to give away to their friends or to a neighboring village. All of these are economies because for us, as anthropologists, the way we think of economies when we look across cultures, we need a broader definition than just sort of a market, because not all societies have that, but all societies have stuff, and they have systems of deciding what to do with stuff. And so for us, an economy is a system of the following. Number 1, production. Number 2, distribution. Number 3, consumption. What that means is an economy is something that every single society has, and it's a system of figuring out how to produce the stuff you need and or want. Number 2, how to distribute that stuff, who gets the stuff. And number 3, consumption, what you do with the stuff once you have it. How you make it, who gets it, how it gets used. And every single culture has to answer that question. So every single culture has some kind of an economy. So first you have production, right? How do we create or obtain the stuff that we use? And in that regard, we would point out that every single part of an economy is ultimately a production where you've taken a natural resource and produced it into a commodity. You've taken a natural resource and turned it into a form that humans use as a commodity. And so that's pretty obvious when we talk about lumber, right? You took a tree and you cut it down and you made some lumber out of it. It's a little less obvious when you talk about a smartphone, because there's no smartphone trees, but that's of course made out of things like rare earth metals or oil that we've shaped into plastic. And if you were to sort of make a list of all the commodities you have on you, in your pockets or in your wallet or in your purse, you'd eventually, if you thought about it enough, realize that every single one of those things is a form of production. Somebody had to take a natural resource and turn it into a usable thing. And sometimes that's a really direct process. Again, you go down to Homer and buy some salmon off somebody. It's a pretty direct form of production. They took a fish and they cooked it for you. Other times, like a smartphone, it's a lot less obvious, but it still ultimately is made out of natural stuff. So that's what production is. Production is when we take when an economy, how a society takes natural resources and adds their own human labor, in this case hunting, to turn it into a usable human product. And in that regard, let's talk briefly about production in terms of land ownership. So critical question, since land is central to everything we do, a critical question any society has to answer is sort of who gets the natural resources, who gets the land that we use to make all the other stuff. And I have sort of, this is meant to be tongue-in-cheek, so don't like put this in my teacher evaluation as this guy, jeez. It says land ownership totally makes sense, except it's freaking crazy. I'm just joking here. Obviously, it's not freaking crazy to have land ownership or private property. I just bought a house with some property, so I get the idea of property, and I don't think it's crazy. But the point I'm making here is that there's a lot of societies where traditionally private property, as we think about it, was not the way that things were done. So, for example, among the Maasai of Eastern Africa, a pastoral group who has traditionally been pastoral for centuries and is still pastoral, cattle herding group, land is not typically dealt with as a private property issue, but instead as a communal property ownership issue. But it's also not just a free-for-all. It's administered by the elders of a lineage. So the elders of the lineage of sort of the extended family group that is sort of your political unit, those elders get together and say, well, you know, there's Joe and there's Jane and there's Tim. These are not good Maasai names. I'm just making up names here. Okay, I don't know good Maasai names, so give me a break. So they say, well, Joe and Jane, y'all are going to herd your cattle over there on this portion of the plains, and Jane, you're going to go do it at this other portion, and then we're going to leave this third portion of land that we traditionally sort of have access to. We're going to leave that alone for a while because, you know, the grass is looking pretty scrubby there, so we want to make sure it grows back. So that's the way in which Maasai people traditionally, and to some degree still today, handle something like land ownership. Or you have groups like the Juhwanzi, which although now their land has been largely sort of gobbled up by other groups and nations such as South Africa and Namibia, traditionally, and again to some degree still today, Juhwanzi didn't really own land. They were a mobile hunter-gatherer group. There was territories that certain people tended to use more than others, and so if you were kind of moving into that territory to go hunt or something, you would go talk to that group and make sure that was cool. But generally speaking, it wasn't land ownership in the sense that we think of it, where land was thought of as something that could be fungible. And actually the fact that we think about land that way typically, I think most of us do, myself included, the fact that we think of land that way is reflected a lot in our language. So again, leaning back on linguistic anthropology, we talk sometimes about the idea of framing. And what we mean by framing is that there's lots of ways to talk about an issue, and how you choose to talk about an issue in a society shapes how people think about it, sort of like the way that you frame a window shapes what picture of the landscape you get. And when you think of land ownership, we frame that in terms that emphasize that it's an object, right? So we talk about natural resources, right? A resource is not a being. A resource is not something you can't own. A resource is something you can own and should own and are expected to use. So the ways in which we speak about land, timber, oil, and animals oftentimes sort of emphasizes this idea of property ownership as a framing. But again, definitely not the only way to do things. Among the Cree, traditionally prior to sort of Canadian colonization, you would have had groups that had traditional territories administered by within their tribal groupings, and then you would have had trap lines that were divvied out by family group, so areas where you're allowed to trap, and then you would have had tallymen, which were these sorts of like leaders in the family that sort of made sure everybody was, you know, on the right line and doing the right thing in the right area. Within Tikopia, traditionally, prior to, I believe it was the British who eventually colonized Tikopia, within the Tikopia, a Polynesian island, traditionally, land was effectively all property of the chief over the entire island, and you had to go give the chief tribute to use his land for farming. And, you know, for the most part, you still owned the land, you got to occupy it and farm it, but you had to give like a little bit of tribute to say like, hey king, hey chief, it's your land, here's my offering. So vastly different ways of owning land. And actually that's part of what I was trying to get at with the reading that you did. So you did that reading from Burke's called The Benefits of the Commons. So if you're not familiar with this, there's a concept that I was trained in environmental science, so this is a lot of times environmental scientists get taught this concept, and it's called the tragedy of the commons. And it's the idea that human beings, if left to their own device, if there's a valuable resource, if that resource isn't controlled by one party, or if there's not rules laid down about the resource, everybody will use that resource until it's exhausted, because each person's looking out for their own self-interest, and so they'll keep using and keep using and keep using until they crash the resource. So the kind of classic example is if you have a bunch of common pasture land and everybody's got a sheep or a herd of sheep, everybody runs their herd of sheep on there until they graze the grass down to nothing. And that's what we call the tragedy of the commons. And that's implicit in a lot of the ways that we do policy here in the United States. So, for example, we set fishing quotas based on the idea that if left to their own devices, commercial fishing groups, as well as private fishing groups and sports fishing groups, will take more than they should and therefore crash the resource, like more than could be sustainable. And so we have this assumption that that's kind of how human beings work. We're driven by that self-interest, and therefore we have to put strict limits on things. So the implication of the tragedy of the commons is that land either has to be privately owned, where people feel like they have, a self-obligation to keep it going because it's their own thing, or land has to be government owned, right, set aside and protected, or else people overuse it. If you just left a piece of land and just said, well, here's forest, do what you want with it, you can build in it, pretty soon too many people are going to cut down all the trees because it's a valuable resource and there's no rules. So in a ruleless, if you don't put rules over a resource, it gets gobbled up. The Burke's reading shared some really good examples of how that's not necessarily always the case, right? So they talked about the lobstermen, I think they call them, in Maine, and how they sort of control who, beyond the regulations that the government puts in place, that a lot of East Coaster fishermen and lobster fishermen kind of put it in their own sort of community regulations, where it's like you have parts of the land where technically anybody can go to, any fisher, but they sort of control amongst the fishing community who gets a boat and who doesn't. You have to be an insider, you have to be a respected fisher, and if you're not, you don't get a boat, and if you don't get a boat, you don't get to use the resource, right? So people that are not viewed as sustainable resource users get forced out or not allowed in to use the resource. So the people self-manage the fishery. They don't need Fish and Game showing up and saying, well, only fish this much, although there are still fishing laws. Instead, they pretty much self-manage it, to the point where, as it talked about in the reading, you'll sometimes have people like, sort of damaging each other's cars or boats or things to basically say like, hey, jerk, you overuse the resource, you don't get to fish here anymore, right? Some old-fashioned intimidation. So that's an example, even here in the United States, where groups are self-managing a common resource without having a bunch of extra really stringent rules and still able to self-manage it. But indeed, we see that in many different societies where we have examples of lands or resources that are collectively held, but they're not overused. And indeed, the idea of private property, private land ownership is relatively recent in human history. And for most of the rest of human history, humans had to figure out how to collectively use pieces of land and make sure that it didn't get overused. In Aboriginal Australia, that was regulated through mythology, through sacred stories. Different clans had different pieces of land for hunting based on their different sacred stories and their sacred ancestors, which attached them to certain places that were attached to the Dreamtime stories. So an entire continent was regulated without any sort of no trespassing signs, because you had this sort of sacred mythology that connected in with the landforms. I'm going to skip this slide because I don't find it very interesting or relevant to what we're talking about right now. And I'm also going to skip this one.